My name is Zeynep Uraguchi. I work for Helvetas. My role here is just to facilitate and also housekeeping. The topic is market facilitation in aid-intensive context. So we're going to navigate the context that I will be talking about, where you have two types of contexts. The first context is about projects that use a direct delivery approach, provide free services, free money to different actors. While at the same time you have projects that try to use systemic approach, try to facilitate change. That's one type of the us versus them type of context. The other context is the partnership competition context, where you have many projects using systemic approach, trying to facilitate, but competing for a limited pool of actors. By actors, we're not only referring to private sector enterprises, but a whole range of government agencies, private sector enterprises, civil society, and target groups. So here, we are talking about the first context. You know, that's what we are going to talk about today. So that's what this session is all about. The next question that we should ask ourselves is that why should we care? We care because when you have this kind of context, it's really challenging. Challenging in terms of risking sustainability, risking scale when projects phase out. It for example, will have in terms of distorting, you know, the incentives of actors. The last question that we ask is what can be done about this kind of challenge, and that's precisely the topic the topic that they will be talking about in terms of presenting their experiences, in terms of presenting their insights. So we have three speakers here from PIN, Nigeria, the partnership initiative in the Niger Delta, funded by Chevron. We have James, who will be talking about his experience. We have also from Helvetas, covering youth employment projects from the Western Balkan, funded by SDC, Natalie. And from the donor side, we have Sirocco, who will be talking about the experience of SDC in terms of donor coordination, particularly focusing on Bangladesh. So he will talk about that. Last but not least, we have here Robbie, who will be reflecting a little bit on the challenge and the way forward by touching the experience of DFID, right? So you will have 10 minutes. So I give back the floor to you. Once the presentations are over, I'll come back to you. We will have three groups to discuss, to reflect, you know. I'll come back to you about the instruction or later. So now, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Natalie.
I'm briefly going to talk about the youth employment project in the Western Balkans. So Helvetas, together with local partners, is implementing 3 youth employment projects in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo, in Albania, and the goal is really to improve employment and income opportunities for young people within those countries. Now, the context where we are operating in, it's very donor dense, but we are sort of the odd ones out. Most of the assistance is focused on a direct delivery. So in Bosnia, for instance, we are the only project that uses an MSD approach. In Kosovo, there's just one other using an MSD approach. And in Albania, there's, other than us, there's just one other project that has just started its design phase, also using an M4P approach. So this prevailing donor culture focus on providing direct assistance, obviously, often collides sort of with our working methodology quite heavily, actually. Often there is sort of little consideration for the market distortion that direct assistance can create, and it obviously also impacts the sustainability on scale, which is really what we want to achieve in our intervention. So just to give you a brief example, from RISI Albania, in Albania from the agro-processing sector. I'm sure that's something most of you can relate to. So RISI Albania sort of tried to introduce a sound commercial market for consultancy services in Albania. So on the one hand, making sure that agro-businesses actually use consultancy services, such as for marketing, but also ensuring that consultancy companies actually consider the processing sector as a viable client. Now, the intervention didn't go very far. It ultimately had to be stopped, and largely because agro-processors didn't really see the value of paying for a service that they could either get for free through a donor, whether it's through technical assistance or having the donor pay a consultancy. And consultancy companies weren't really interested because their main clients are donors. So yeah, that's sort of the context that we're facing, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So yes, next. So what do we do now, right? So it's clearly donors are in the sphere where we are working. So how can we, the challenge therefore really is how can we ensure that this available funding doesn't really impede sort of our long-term goal for sustainability and scale, or differently put, how can projects ensure that available donor funding contributes to long-term and sustainable changes in the market system? And over the past couple of years, yes, next, we have developed 3 emerging sort of coping strategy. And the first of them is influencing how project partners make use of available donor money. And here the example comes from the Market Makers project in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And there we basically we helped facilitate the establishment of an IT industry association called BID Alliance. And sorry, can you just press next? So we're the first one really to sort of be involved with this IT industry association. So we helped them come up with a financing model based on membership fees, which will hopefully reduce the risk of becoming donor dependent. And it's really based on the idea of being sort of the first mover before anyone else jumps on the bandwagon. And the second aspect of that is that we really tried to position ourselves in a way where we could advise our project partner when to make use of donor money. So help them differentiate between when donor money can be used to sort of further their goal without, however, undermining sort of their long-term sustainability. And so one of the things that actually came up was the first joint activity of this industry association was BID Camp. So an intensive IT training course. And that was the first sort of joint activity, and they simply didn't have the capital yet generated through the membership fees to pay for the upfront operating costs. So what they really needed was some seed capital to kick off the first cycle. And there, the projects or market makers took a very conscious approach of helping them to identify and approach donors that could potentially provide this sort of upfront capital, but with a clear understanding this would only be temporary until sort of the internal revenue was generated. Again, it was a very hands-on approach. The project really actually became an associate member in this industry association for 18 months, and that allowed it to really sort of like leverage and also influence sort of how they engaged with other donors. That's one example. The second example is sort of on the other hand, so it's sort of more the supply side, influencing donor spending behavior. And here the example comes from I in Kosovo. So I Kosovo had this one initiative called Females in IT, so where they wanted to encourage more women to participate in IT courses at the American University of Kosovo. Now, one of the main constraints why women weren't participating was because they didn't have access to a lot of funding opportunities. So while there was a huge interest for these IT trainings, many of them actually lacked funding opportunities because banks would often not give them loans. So in addition to helping the American University of Kosovo come up with a sort of a sustainable business model, they sort of wanted to tackle the wider sort of constraint of there not being enough funding opportunities for women in IT. So they become sort of an advocate and a spokesperson for the sector. So the project really shared its data, information, knowledge with other relevant stakeholders within the skills development sector, whether it's government, other project, private stakeholders. And it really proactively sought an exchange with these relevant stakeholders. So it held conferences, it participated in roundtable discussions, and was just really active in trying to leverage the information it had. So when one of the donors was then about to design a credit line to the Ministry of Economic Development in Kosovo, it was asked by the ministry to be part of a working group on how to decide how to disperse this available money. And obviously the project used that opportunity to advocate for parts of this money to be attributed to skills. Now again, similar to the first example, it's a very hands-on approach. It's a really actively trying to engage with other relevant stakeholders and trying to sort of influence their spending behaviors through sort of the knowledge that you already have. Now, the third strategy is slightly different, and it sort of goes into finding a niche area to intervene in, so it's sort of the uncharted water example. And this comes from Risi, Albania, and the idea is to focus on sectors or subsectors that really have not caught the attention of anybody else. And here, Risi, Albania chose to intervene in the BPO sector, which is the business process outsourcing, and thought, oh, we might help them to sort of like bring in a higher value added BPO sector into the country, so focusing on HR or risk analysis or accounting. Now, because no one had worked on this sector before, neither donor nor government, they were the first ones to really interact with this BPO association. Now, this strategy obviously bears certain risks, so you don't just want to intervene in a sector because no one else is there. It should still be relevance, feasibility, opportunity that should really guide you when you intervene in a sector. And secondly, it cannot really stay on its own, because once others are sort of jumping on the bandwagon, right, you still have to be able to develop a strategy for those partners to deal with donors and their available funding. So it might be coupled actually with strategy A and B. Now, after going quickly through all of these, what does it actually mean? So clearly other donors influence the market systems that we work in, when we're really honest. And what we've done in these examples is really to consider donor presence, albeit slightly implicitly, as market actors. So they influence the informal, formal rules, the functions very operating. So maybe you should be slightly more honest with each other and actually start thinking of them as market actors. And that might be slightly provocative. And it's not like we have an answer, but maybe we should start thinking about developing strategies to actually engage with donors. Maybe just like with any other market actors, we can start thinking about their interests, incentives, capacities, and how we actually engage them in our work. And that might actually also help us to build them in already a little bit earlier, so during the design phase, rather than sort of in a costly ad hoc manner. And there we might actually also find some opportunities for collaboration. That's something that James is going to talk about.
Okay, I'm going to spend some brief moment to talk about PIN Foundation, because I discovered that in this conference, I've spent about 30% of my time explaining what PIN Foundation is. So I'll refer you to the website, but it's a unique foundation, it's a unique organization, because this is an organization funded not by DFID or World Bank or any typical donor, but it's funded by an oil company, Chevron. So it's very, very unusual. And it's also working in an unusual context. You know, it was founded in 2010 with an initial funding of about $50 million, and in the second phase, it has attracted additional funding of about $40 million over the next 10 years. So working in a region, the full meaning actually is Foundation for Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is the part of Nigeria where you have a lot of oil explorations, you know, degradation of environment. It's an area coming from 10 years of civil war and crisis. You know, it's kind of post-crisis situation, and you're having to implement a market systems development project there. So you can imagine the kind of challenge what that entails. Good. So what I'm going to do now is to present how Chevron, an oil company, has managed to work with a donor, two donors actually, the DFID and the USAID within the same space. It all started with a very short story of the aquaculture sector in the Niger Delta, a very low intervention that has gotten to this stage now. Now, for example, Nigeria's fish industry is about 1.5 million metric tons. About half of that, 50% of that, is actually met by import. So you see the massive gap. And part of the reason is because of the inefficiency in production. So as a result of this assessment, we're able to, PIND actually got into the center stage. And we're able to get the buy-in of other actors after designing the intervention. First of all, we had the Association of Farmers. It's actually called the United Informal Fish Farmers Association, which is actually the biggest farming cluster in West Africa, with over 800 farmers and about 4,000 ponds within the same cluster. So they took responsibility for organizing, coordinating, and financing the participation of their members. And then the hatchery operators brought fingerlings. Then feed companies provided free feed because we actually saw the business case to them. They saw it as an opportunity to invest and also as an opportunity to extend their marketing tools. And then paid the specialist consultant who was responsible for the day-to-day running of the demo pond. I also developed the curriculum so that there will be a format for handing over this knowledge, and then also provided the training. At the end of the first pilot, we saw that profitability increased from 5% at baseline to about 22%, which is 65% increase in profitability. That's quite high. And then we also noticed that the feed companies increased their customer base by 30%. On the basis of this, we took the results on a roadshow to few other feed companies so that we can get them to crowd in. And in this second phase, the feed companies then took the center stage. And you can see PIND went to the facilitation side, providing the training of trainers for the staff of feed companies who can actually learn how to do demonstrations, and also other independent consultants, and also took responsibility for training of trainers for external consultants that would like to provide training and advisory services to fish farmers. And then, as usual, the farmers providing the training sites, and then the consultants were provided with the training of trainers and supervision, and the hatchery companies as well supplied the fingerlings. Then what happened? After that, we discovered that the thing started growing organically. Other support functions actually started coming in. The financial institutions saw this as an opportunity because they saw a large pool of fish farmers, 800 fish farmers, 4,000 ponds, big market opportunity. So they started developing financial products. But they didn't really understand the sector, didn't know how to go about it. So we provided them with training to really understand how to manage the aquaculture sector. And then the fishery extension service providers also started emerging because of the opportunities, and as well as the private consultants. And then there's also another challenge because when fish farmers produce, they are forced to sell at a loss because after harvest, if they don't really have means of prolonging the shelf life for the fish. So as a result of that, the smoking king manufacturers saw an opportunity so that the fish farmers can actually process their fish, smoke it, and extend the shelf life of the fish, and also be in a position to take control of their pricing. And so there are also other donors. Like I said, the DFID MAID saw this as a massive opportunity, who actually came on stage. They also took it up. And then the USAID Market 2 project, who at the strategic level wasn't really using the market systems approach, but at the tactical level, because they were working with us within the SAM office, they started adopting the tactics. Now, this is a bigger story. This is MAID, DFID MAID, then came fully on stage and actually brought in another dimension. What did they do? Under their model, the consultants now took the center stage. What are the consultants doing? The consultants will go to the feed company and say, I have this large pool of fish farmers. If you can provide your feed, I can actually use this to do a demonstration. And that kind of becomes a marketing tool for the feed companies. So the consultants took the center stage, approaching the feed companies and linking them up with the farmers and also the hatchery operators, with all these supporting functions growing. Now, this is a very good demonstration of how donors actually can work together. So that's it. There you go. How do we make all this possible? Before PIN came to the Niger Delta area, there were no donors. Investments were actually going out of the region because of the crisis and the problem in that situation. And when PIN came on board, the DFID actually said one of the conditions that we're going to use in working here is that the project they're going to fund must collaborate with PIN. And so what happened? When MAID came on board, they basically didn't have to do new assessments. They took the assessments that were already done by PIN, took the interventions, took all the result chains, and scaled it up. Basically, the assessment reports and the scale-up of pilots, that's what they did. And then there was also some form of cost sharing, in combined staff training. We brought in, DAI for some training, and the cost of that training was actually shared between PIN, USID, and as well as DFID. And then we also started spreading resources. If MAID is going to give a grant, usually they're going to call on PIN to also bring in the name of potential beneficiaries. And so we give out the grants as one entity, not as MAID, not as PIN, but just as one entity. What else did we do? We have quarterly review meetings, both at the strategic level and at the technical level. So what's happening is that the PIN actually provided office space for USID markets and DFID MED. So we all within the same office space. We have quarterly meetings. We are working in the same sector, the same partners. And some of the resources are part of the DFID and USID programs are beginning to adopt market system development. Ordinarily, they don't do it. But at the tactical level, because we're all having to work together as one team. So each time they're implementing the interventions, they're beginning to use market systems approach. So, but it wasn't all that rosy because there are challenges involved, because sometimes there's tendency for partners to go with the donors that they perceive that have the money. Okay, so we all decided that if there's going to be a grant or any form of technical assistance, we all need to make it as a team. So that way, there's always continuous review. And the donor, DFID, always insisted that the two programs have to work together. And USAID has that understanding. So the donor has a critical role to play to ensure that there is effective coordination, both at the strategic level, and the technical guys need to have quarterly review meetings to align their processes and strategies. That way, programs will not be it won't be perfect, but to a large extent, there will be effective donor coordination. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, welcome in this session. I will try to give a few thoughts about what do we think from SDC side about the whole topic of coordination. Basically, if you allow me, I would like to start first with a clarification of terminology. The last 2 days, I heard the word donor at least 100 times. And I was wondering, are we donors? Are we not development partners? Are we really still donors? I also see the session has the title Aid Intensive Context. Are we giving aid or are we doing development cooperation? I mean, I don't have to tell all of you, we had Paris, we had Accra, we had Addis Abeba, financing for development. We have Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. There have been many changes in what is called here aid, or what I call development cooperation. I will come later back to that, but it really, somehow stumbled over that the last 2 days. We have seen in the beginning, Senebe presented nicely, there are in a way 2 types of contexts where we work in. Sometimes it's also both in one context, meaning you can have direct delivery approaches and a few projects who work with a facilitative approach, or you can have a lot of projects who use a facilitative approach. But then even this situation can happen that you have also a lot of other direct funded projects or direct implemented projects. So I'm working in a context which is probably a combination of both. In Bangladesh, we have a lot of facilitative approaches, a lot of market development projects, but we also have massive amounts of funding for livelihood, social sector programs, etc., etc. What I will try to do in my short speech is to probably look at four areas of where I see the challenge of coordination. The areas are in a way at different levels. So one area is how do the development partners coordinate with what I would call the host government, the government of the country where we are working. We have another layer which is basically among the development partners, how do they coordinate. And we have, many of you probably are in a situation that your project is funded by more than one donor, so there is a question of coordination with multiple donors. And then we have a bit the scenario, the second type, meaning lots of donors or several donors funding a variety of projects. So there are different types of coordination issues in each of these cases. What I will try to do with today basically is to shortly give for each one of these challenges a challenge, basically to show you what challenge or what's a challenge I have experienced in my work. I will also try to show you what's a good practice, just an example to stimulate the discussion afterwards, and then probably also a few ideas about what can implementers do, or what are indications for implementers how to deal with it. So if you let me start with the first challenge, which is the host government and development partners. That brings me back to my initial statement. If we say we are in development cooperation and not in aid, that means the host government drives the agenda. And that means we actually need to listen much more to the host government. We need to listen to what's the economic and national economic priorities or the overall national priorities of the host government where we are working. I believe this will only get stronger. We development partners are aligning. We are under pressure to align, and we also like to align. So this will only become stronger. And I think this is also important for market systems development projects to understand. On top of that, what we experience is it's not very easy to talk to the host government about market systems and facilitative approaches. You have probably experienced the same as I have. For instance, you go to the government, you talk about your reporting and budgeting. They have activity budgeting and reporting. We have result reporting budgeting. The host government may have different priorities. They have economic priorities which are going into infrastructure. And then you come with like, okay, let's facilitate the market. So they may say, okay, not really of our interest. It's not in our national plan, for instance. We have issues around monitoring, result measurement. What are we measuring is not necessarily what the government wants to know. There are issues also around basically the idea that the government in many countries where we're working still has the ambition to be the one who delivers the services. While we are saying, okay, basically your role is to just enable the context to make sure that the businesses can work. So there's lots of contradictions, and on top of that, you need to steer. You have a project steering committee, very often with the government. So how do you steer if we don't necessarily talk of the same thing? So that's the challenge. I'm keen to hear from you a bit afterwards how you're dealing with it. I don't have a lot of good examples or good practices here. One good practice we have in Bangladesh, I think, is to engage very early with the government, to be clear also with which ministry are we going to work, engaging early and then working with the government at all levels, meaning from national level, district, sub-district, even down to villages or municipalities, possibly. What does it mean for an implementer? I think, like I said in the beginning, it's important that also implementers read, understand, and align with economic priorities of a country. It's not only the role of the development partner, I think it's also the role of an implementer to be within this bigger picture. Where I think the implementer and the development partner can work together is when it comes into the kind of discussions I mentioned earlier, when it's difficult to talk with the government. When the government does not understand our language, etc., I think more often we could go jointly meaning using also with the leverage of an embassy or of a development agency so that the government listens to us. And maybe last, avoiding a trap, which I have heard quite often. We are a market systems development project. It's difficult to work with government, so just let's not work with them. I think it just doesn't work. It has fired back in Bangladesh, and it just doesn't work. Now, if I look at between the development partners, the coordination issues are equally challenging. First of all, I have to say, I mean, this is a reality. Market system development is not the only approach which is in our portfolio of instruments. We have many, many different approaches which we can use. I'm still okay with time? Yeah, okay. I like to talk a lot, sorry. So I think we have a lot of instruments which we can use, and not necessarily always market systems development is the avenue to take. It depends really what we want to achieve. I was actually at lunchtime, I was arguing with some colleagues, we could also relax a bit. We don't have to convince everybody about market system development approach, and that's the only approach. It's okay if some projects are done like that and others differently. What we also experienced is, because of that, but also because the strategies of development partners are constantly evolving, it's quite difficult between development partners to come together and, for instance, to agree on a joint funding of a program, or even coordinating around the program. I mean, the example you gave is a good example, but there's many not so good examples also, or difficult examples, I think. So that's about the challenge. Examples, what is a good practice, what we have as example in Bangladesh is we have a government-led donor coordination or development partner coordination group. It's called local consultative group. I guess in most countries you have such groups. The idea is basically that we development partners meet among ourselves and discuss about things like duplications, joint funding, and things like that. For the implementer, I think an implication could be is the lessons learning, the sharing of lessons learned. We talked about that already last 2 days. The sharing of lessons learned beyond your actual development partner, beyond the funding, the funder you're having with other development partners, I think is very important. And there comes the aspect of evidence-based, transparent, and I can say maybe credible lessons learned, not public relation. I think none of the development partners is interested in hearing how great an implementer is. We are rather interested to hear what have you achieved, what has worked, and most importantly, what has not worked. So, and I think that would help a lot then, again, back up when we have our coordination groups among the development partners so we can discuss with tangible information. Ooh. Good. Let's speed up. We have the situation I described. A project can have several donors, multiple donors. Challenges are probably familiar to you. You have the development partners who come in one phase and they go out in another phase. If you're lucky, you have one which stays all the time, but that's also not necessarily. They come in with different expectations, different results they want to achieve. Within the development partners, we have talked about that, I think, in a session yesterday. You have a lot of changes of the staff, and it also depends on the development partner how much resources they have to actually guide and steer your program. Some development partners like to be much more hands-on, to steer and to guide. Others are more hands-off, and that's again a challenge. And then, yeah, let's stick with these two. Basically, let's say, I mean, for the project side, what is the challenge then is in a way to, how do you meet all these expectations? It starts with basic things like reporting or financial systems, but also more complex issues than if you talk about systemic change. What does the development partner expect from you? How does each development partner understand the systemic change? What are good practices we can share is very important, are clear contractual arrangements. So if you have multiple donors, make from the beginning very clear there is one lead donor, the others are contributing donors. Ideally, the lead donor is also the one with whom you're having the contract. So you're not spread out over several development partners. I know it's not always possible, but it's certainly a good practice. What we have in the program Catalyst, and I can shortly share, is also different levels of steering. We have strategic review panels, which basically involve from implementer side, the headquarters, the regional office, and the project staff. We are not represented there, so there is strategic decisions being made on the implementation side. Then we have a donor management board where the Catalyst management meets with us. And then we have a donor committee where only the donors or the development partners are meeting. And last but not least, we have the steering committee. So there's several layers of coordination happening in that project. Now for the implementers, I think the implications are clear. Like I said, insist on one leading development partner, but don't I use here the difficult word, leave no one behind, in terms of leave no development partner behind. Yeah, this is dangerous if you focus only on one and the others may be left behind. To close, on the last situation where you have several development partners funding a variety of projects, maybe a few thoughts about that. We have seen in the examples already, and you know that very well as implementers, we have then this competition phenomena arising that the private sector firms with which we are trying to work, they're running after the money, they're budgeting our funds into their own budgets, and there is a competition between the projects which is unhealthy and, for instance, also results then in cost shares which are not very optimal and not decreasing over time. What I seem to understand from the example you have just been given, what is a good practice, I would say, is mixed coordination platforms between development partners and implementers. I have been involved myself a lot in this type of platforms in skills development, and it has proven to be very effective. If the development partners and the implementers meet on a regular basis, it can be informal, it doesn't need to have any structure, it doesn't cost any money, you just go to each other's offices and meet. You have to leverage a bit the development partners that they're also joining, but if it's interesting discussions, they will do, and that will help to actually reduce duplication and all kind of other problems we're facing. Yeah, and maybe as a takeaway, yeah, try to do that in your own cases. Try to talk with your funding partners whether such a platform could not be a good idea. I think I stop here because anybody already got up, so thanks.
Very much. Yes. So now we heard these three cases, you know, from the donor side, Asia, we have also two implementers, one from Africa and the other from Eastern Europe. Now, what we are going to do next is we divide ourselves into three groups. And what we are going to do is we come up with two relevant questions, each group, to be discussed in plenary. That's the first kind of exercise that we're going to do. When you do that, you also come up with a suggestion for a follow-up mechanism or process, how we can deepen and broaden this kind of discussion. We will be very much interested, you know. We don't want to say now we're going to have a working group or something like that, but we'd like to hear from you. How can we take these insights, these experiences to the next level? That will be our interest. So to repeat, I mean, come up with two critical relevant questions for discussion here. And when you do so, a suggestion, practical suggestion, process mechanisms, that will be also very, very helpful for us to take it to the next level. So if I randomly divide one table to three, and the rest of you can, you know, join these groups, we will have 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and we will have the open discussion.
To a contractors. And who's setting the vision here? Is it really coming from the host governments? Is it coming from I mean, you know, in an ideal situation, I think that's true. My observation is that the reality is a lot lower. two questions relevant to the several things have been discussed about this. We are discussing a case where there are no donors but are collaborating and working. There was the other first case, the more accurate message. Then there is the third case. In terms of real coordination working together, I think that is so keep saying that is the most difficult. I think that's how it is in most countries. National level, you mean the local level? Yeah. The local level is you can see it. But then again, the guys are
Okay, sorry. I'm really sorry for interrupting, stopping this very interesting discussion amongst yourselves. But in order to have also enough time for discussion, maybe we should wrap up here. Maybe let me start from this group, the questions are not necessarily directed at the presenters, but the participants here can also answer the questions based on their experiences. We have some people from donors, although Sirocco doesn't like the word development, what? Development partners, okay. So maybe let me start from this group. If you can just read out or say the question. Yeah, what's the question?
Two questions. One is, how does aid-intensive context affect the program results? So, and what should then the implementers do to manage the effects of aid-intensive context? And so as solutions, I guess, the questions were pretty much covered by the presenters, I believe. We talked about how it affects the program results and what they should be doing. Natalia has presented some suggestions. But on top of that, the group has discussed about two more options that could be considered. One is when we are doing the market systems analysis, as Natalia also proposed, taking the donors, understanding what the donors are doing. So if you're doing a wider market systems analysis, then you understand what are the different projects, how they're influencing the agenda, what would be their effects on the program. So you essentially understand the overall environment. If you're understanding the overall environment, then eventually know, what kind of interventions would work and what would not work. So, then the question of, having a huge pressure of not being able to deliver shouldn't exist, because you are then able to use those insights from the market analysis to manage the expectations. So when we're talking about managing expectations, I guess the point is, when the donors are giving the mandate, they have the targets given to the project implementers. And then the project implementers are doing the market systems analysis, coming up with interventions, and then you have the pressure to deliver the results. But your systems analysis suggests that because of aid-intensive context, you can do so, and you can't. So there is there is then a point to manage the expectation, to revisit the targets, or even change the mandate of the project to a certain degree to ensure that you are able to deliver better. So I guess it all starts from the point of view of analyzing better, having a much wider point of view of analyzing it, and then if you have analyzed it, manage your expectations better. So, yeah.
Anybody who would like to react to that, to answer, reflect? Yes.
Just add, I think my colleague spoke a lot about how does aid-intensive context affect program results, but just on that question about implementers and what should implementers do, and throughout the question is, what constrains us more with working with other programs? Is it because they're direct delivery, or is it really because they're run by different implementers, or perhaps run by different development partners?
Would you like to react? Yes, please.
Not really react, but just to add to that, there is a contradiction there, because we are increasingly forced is maybe the wrong word, but we have to increasingly tender our projects, and then at the same time, as a development partner, we are also interested in this type of collaboration, and there is a clear contradiction.
Well, I think from my experience over the last few years, started off in an office 4.5 years ago, with just myself and a few others on one program. Now that office has 4 other programs run by ASI, 200 staff or something, and I find that I can work with those programs, even though they're direct delivery, very easily because of the location, similar management, I know the teams, whereas other market systems programs who are run by a different implementer, I find much harder to work with. It's almost like a glass ceiling there. I'm not sure why it happens, but it does.
Yeah, just to support the last speaker, I think you're completely spot on, very right, because in our own example, the DAI, for example, manages the DFID MED project, and at the same time provides technical assistance to PIN Foundation. So it's a lot easier. When they come to do the review, they do the review of both projects, you know, with somebody like Bill Grant coming around. You know, you see easily lessons from both programs kind of interface, you know, so I think that makes it a lot easier, having common implementers.
The competition between the different contracting companies is quite high. I mean, for example, Kevin and I actually live in the same town. We go drinking in the same place. And both our bosses worry that we know each other. Why don't the development partners, the people who contract us, put it in our contracts? In other words, you put it in the contract as a performance thingy. If you do not coordinate with other code, we're going to knock 15% off your monthly payment. I'll get fired for that, but anyway.
Okay, Peter here.
It's in the general conditions that it's public good and public information, so it can be shared with everybody. So your boss doesn't want to, that's a problem. and another point is we don't give you time and we don't pay you for coordination and exchanging, and that's the error. We should have a budget line for to take a beer with Kevin.
So my question is for Kevin 1 or 2, whichever Kevin you are. Sorry, 3. So I'm just curious as to you know, when with the same implementer you have facilitative and direct delivery. Like, is that the same value chains or different value chains, or how do you decide how to split it, and how does it not come in conflict within your programs?
Yeah, they're all different sectors within the building, but there is 2 programs. One is GEMS 3, their business environment, but they work on specific investment, land and tax. And Enable, which I'm on, is on advocacy in the business environment. So there is that overlap there. And the ways we've managed that is, I think it was Natalie's point, is accepting that they are a market player and are going to be for the next few years. We can advise them on sustainability or exit strategies, but we recognize that they're talking to the same people, they're offering incentives for them to work with them. So some of the tools we've used is we've actually sat down and developed joint result chains saying, okay, we all want to see this reform happen. We are going to do it this way by building the capacity of our partners to advocate through a facilitative approach, and this is our general timelines, and they're going to provide some technical expertise in key areas, maybe a reform of a law or whatever it may be. I think that transparency can initially add a bit of friction in the room when you're discussing how to do it, but in the longer term, everyone knows where they stand and what you're aiming for, and we share that with the development partners so they can see, and they do appreciate that we are trying to be innovative and being quite clear on who's taking responsibility. We've also worked with Collins, Propcom, where we're working on media's ability to report on business activities in agriculture. We don't have agriculture experts on our team. We've worked with Propcom, where they've provided people who can do value training for media reporters, and that's coming to fruition now, where we're seeing more business media reports on agriculture as well. So there is ways to do it. One with Propcom, I think, was a one-off. We might repeat it. The other one was more a design and going forward for a full intervention.
I just want to throw a little spanner in the works based on what my colleague here, Peter. My biggest problem sometimes, even on coordination and working with several other people, is some silly thing that we have to get involved in. When I'm working with a private sector partner, the first thing that I normally am asked to sign is non-disclosure agreement. And the minute you sign that, basically you are walking with your legs tied with a rope. And that can sometimes be a major problem, even coordinating at that level, because that non-disclosure agreements means that I can only reveal so much to another program software. So those are the difficulties that you meet when you are operating in this environment that we are talking about. All right, what we talked about is this. I've remembered. Okay, right. I think we just generated two questions that are really closely related. One is, when we are working in this aid-intensive environment, we need to try and find out what level of aid intensiveness presents a problem to a market development program. The reason why we are saying this is that there could be aid intensiveness because there are so much money chasing very few partners. Or it could be aid intensiveness where there are so many people operating, some basically giving handouts even to the real poor beneficiaries we are targeting. So there are several types of aid intensiveness. Which one really presents a problem? The second question is, how do we then respond differently to each of these? These are things that could actually give us the tools to work in this space. Yeah.
Aid intensity. Okay. In the aid literature, there is a definition, what we mean by aid intensity, but I don't want to answer the question here. So what level of aid intensity are we talking about, and how do we respond accordingly to the different levels? Yes, who would like to? Yes, Natalie.
But now, coming from sort of the Western Balkan perspective, where most of the projects really are based on direct delivery, one thing that we've started doing within Helvetas is actually sort of propagate the MSD approach more widely. So when we have training sessions, internal training sessions for MSD, we actually do make a point of inviting a range of different project managers from projects who are not necessarily MSD projects. So for instance, we are part of a youth portfolio in Bosnia. So I'm based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so we are supposed to be dealing with sort of the private sector growth, market makers, demand side. There's another project focusing on intermediation, another one focusing sort of on skills development. And in one of our trainings, we actually invited the deputy project managers of these projects to our training, similar with other projects that are not necessarily affiliated with us. And that's also sort of creating a little bit more of an understanding and awareness of the different working methodologies that you can apply. And it might be not sort of like an easy, quick solution, but we do actually find it quite helpful, especially then when we talk to other donors as well.
Perhaps maybe to try and respond to the question that Collins puts on the table. The project that I'm working on, one of our key objectives is to facilitate the commercial distribution of certified seed. But the number of companies, seed companies, that are in northern Mozambique, very few. In principle, I think we have about 6 good seed companies. But what's happening now is all the projects, programs, we are in principle chasing 6 partners. And these partners are now, concentrating on working with, the projects that give them the greatest financial support. And one of my big challenges also is that I actually think that it's taking them away from developing the business, concentrating more on chasing easy donor money. So it's a big problem, yeah.
Okay, following closely on that, I work in Afghanistan, and it's a whole ball game altogether. You have everybody that has their checkbook walking around with it. So if they want to develop the poultry sector, they are writing checks, and they have their specific way the way they want things done. So whoever is prepared to do it that way gets a check. That's one. They want to communicate what they are doing. So they'll set up radio stations and they'll fund them. And they'll tell them, you'll broadcast our messages. $50,000 a year, this is your budget. And I come in with a market systems development program and I say, how do I work with the radio station? to push extension messages to the farmers that I want to talk to. And the radio station says, how much money do you have for this? To me, that's aid intensive. Mm-hmm. That's the context. And what do we do? What the Nigerian case that just came out, I was like to myself, what a coincidence. I would love to be in that kind of setup.
That's the solution that you're proposing, right? Yeah.
Just to top it up a bit, one thing we've done, especially when it comes to so many aid money chasing very few implementing partners, especially the input companies. The temptation, just like you said, is for the input companies who have a tendency to tilt towards the project with grants. But one of the ways to do it is to ensure that at the project level, all of you are going to be speaking with one voice. So if another project is going to give a grant to an input company, you're all going to say, we're giving out this grant on behalf of all of us. And this is something we've managed to do with DFID and the USAID, giving out a grant to a beneficiary. In fact, last week, MAID gave a grant to one of our beneficiaries. The money comes from MAID, but the beneficiary was actually introduced by us. So they are seeing it as joint grant. That's one of the ways that can actually happen. But the question again I like to have, and which kind of worries me, a situation where a donor gives disbursement targets to projects, and in a market system situation, where grants are actually supposed to reward performance, okay? And for you to achieve some changes in behavior in the support market, it takes at least 1 year, or in most cases 2 years. But again, you see disbursement target from year 1. So I think something we need to reconcile.
What can be done about it, maybe from other donors?
Look, this is something that we discussed here as well, and we are in a situation in Mozambique right now where we have the Innovagro project, and 2 of the projects have come. I'm not going to say who the donor is, you guess, but so it's an aid-intensive situation where you have 2 projects who come from the same donor, and the impression we have is that they're actually doing the same thing, those 2 projects who are financed by the same donor, and again doing sort of what we're doing already. It's complicated, it's tough, we don't have the solution for that, and it's like you said, even if we give grants saying, okay, this is a common grant, but those projects do have the pressure, the political internal pressure to spend. They will have spending targets. Then what do you do about it? I mean, it's really tough.
Still on yeah, very short. I was talking about these different levels of coordination, and I think the challenge which was now discussed of several projects working with the same implementation partner firm. In my opinion, this is a failure of coordination between development partners. And the reality is, I mean, I work in an office in Bangladesh. We usually know about another development partner doing something usually when it's too late. So it's very difficult also for us. I guess my colleague from Mozambique has the same experience.
Thanks very much, Rob. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Robbie here. He's also representing DFID. He would like to summarize, the key takeaways, but also a little bit reflect on that, the way forward, right? Robbie.
A little bit about me. So my name is Robbie Barkell. I work in DFID in London. So I might have a slightly different perspective from Sirocco, and I'm the kind of view from the centre. So I work in DFID's Growth and Resilience Department, where I manage 3 centrally managed programmes, one of which is the Beam Exchange, which we're all here for. But the other 2 actually deliver on the ground in several different countries. I seem to have been given programs with funny names. So I've got Beam, I've got Laser, and I've got iFuse. So together I've got Laser and Beam. Anyway, that's who I am. But it does mean that donor coordination is a big deal to me. So Laser works in 8 different countries. It's not a market systems program, but it is an investment climate program. iFuse works in 27 countries. So lots of questions in my mind about coordination. So this has been really useful. I've been asked to kind of sum up some of the key lessons that I've heard from the presentations and from the group, and to just give a little bit of perspective from me, from DFID's view in the centre. So, thank you. In terms of the presentations, I was thinking, what will I take away as my kind of cheat notes that I've learned, and what have I scribbled down? I think from Natalie's, I got these 3 coping strategies for different types of aid-intensive environments. The first was influencing how partners use donor money, and this kind of transparency issue around that. The second one was around influencing donor spending behaviour. It's a particularly interesting one for me. I might come back to that one. And thirdly, about finding a niche area, as we saw in Albania. So that was good. I thought it was a brilliant start and a brilliant kind of laying out of the context and different strategies. Then moving on to James, I really liked this point about how Pinned and Made had been working together and this kind of cross-program working that we hear. I actually think in my head some programs are so big I don't know if they coordinate amongst themselves always, and that's also a question I have. But it was great to see that perhaps by having some of the same implementing partners, how that was able to work in Nigeria. I also thought the kind of coordinating of grants, so the offer is the same, it makes sense, but how often do we actually do it? So it was great, a great example. Moving on to Sirocco, who had the kind of the donor in-country perspective. And I got a few things from that. I think, you know, how we have to understand the priorities of the host government. And again, another thing that we say and we give lip service to, but do we just do that at the beginning of a program or do we do that continuously? Secondly, using the evidence-based results that aren't just PR. And I think some of the plenaries we've had in the conference where we've heard about the different types of evidence we have from market systems and the kind of tendency to use documents that perhaps are a little bit too media-friendly rather than being a bit more reflective. You know, how many lessons of failure have we had? Could we use those to leverage? Thirdly, I also heard about, well, I shouldn't call them donors, should I? It was development partners, but I think I'm going to revert to type, unfortunately. But about how we manage expectations, and I think this came out of some of the group discussions as well, and how can we use the market analysis at the beginning of our programs to manage expectations from the beginning. I thought it was really useful. And this whole point about using innovative platforms to bring together your donors and your implementing partners. So that was fantastic. I think from the groups we had a few things. I thought this this idea about making sure your market system analysis is done in the right way. I really like the point about Afghanistan. I might come back to that. How do we do this in different sectors? Are the rules the same in every sector? How do we do this in a humanitarian context? I mean, it's probably a whole session in itself, but the BEAM team have been doing some work talking to humanitarian response teams, and how do we ensure that they don't mess everything up before the market systems advisors come along afterwards? In fact, the SEEP network were at the Knowledge Arena earlier today with their principles on, which are quite interesting. So if you're interested, you should check those out. Then a couple of other things. I mean, I thought Peter's point about donors need to be thinking about what we put in budget lines, including coordination. Whether we're paying for people's beers, I'm not quite sure, but something along those lines sounds sensible. So I think that's kind of the things I learned. I guess what I would just give is a few, probably 4 reflections just from me, from a kind of more central view from DFID. One of them would just be probably the obvious, but donors are complex. And just because you're coordinated with the country office donor staff doesn't mean that I in the centre am aware of that. Part of my job is meant to be coordinating all of the market systems programmes within DFID. And I find that very difficult. We're supposed to have over 40 programs using a market systems approach. And I would love to tell you that I could list them all, but I can't. So help us join them up, please. So that's the first one, we're complex. Secondly, I think coming back to this issue of time and the program cycle, I think when I would most likely think about coordination and who is in coordination across implementing partners and donors, probably at the beginning of a program. But how often do we come back to that and revisit that analysis, that stakeholder mapping throughout the program cycle? So it's complex, time. Third one was around scale, and I think we are moving towards bigger programming in general. Programs where we have different implementers for different arms. I've seen some interesting internal learning pieces saying that when we do that, we don't often talk to each other across. Why are we not incentivizing our partners to do that? I don't know. So that feels like the kind of, if we're going to do this at scale, how are we going to make sure not the internal coordination is working as well as externally? And finally, I think the sectors point, just thinking about in different arenas. How do we do it in Afghanistan? How do we ensure that humanitarian responders don't just build a bakery because a town is out of bread, but they actually leave something that a market systems approach can do afterwards? So I was meant to give some tangible next steps, which I'm trying to think about. I mean, I guess more sessions like these and more communications are always a good way to do it, but I wanted to be a bit more specific than that. So a few things. I mean, there was a similar webinar along these lines earlier in the year, which you should check out on the Beam website. It was done in January, and I recommend the blog that went along with it. I think in terms of better communications, there's a few things. When Mike did his kind of run-through of the Beam website yesterday in the morning session, he mentioned this new Beam program database that's going to go online. Now, I'm not going to put all my hopes into a database, but it does sound quite an interesting tool. We've tried to do things internally at DFID like this to map all of our market systems programs, and we found it quite difficult. So it'd be interesting to see where Beam gets to with this, because in theory, if we could look at what's happening in different countries and across different sectors, it could be a very good tool. And I'm sure it will be. I think there's also an upcoming blog on the Beam site about GEMS in Nigeria that talks a fair bit about coordination challenges and successes. I think I will leave it there. Yes, I will. Thank you all for coming. Do you want to give a final word?
Yes. Thanks very much, Thanks very much. So I hope you got some concrete things, insights, as the poster says. Particularly the 3 questions that I posed when I was introducing what it is all about when we say navigating density, market facilitation in aid-intensive context. Number 2, why should we care? Number 3, what can be done about it, So with that, we really look forward, to having you in a different format, which we will think about. But for now, I would like to thank you on behalf of the speakers here, and also Robbie. Thanks very much for coming. I don't want to hold you anymore here. Thanks very much indeed.